After only 75,000 miles, the lower control arms on my Cayenne Turbo have failed. I knew this repair was coming, as I have seen other owners come and go on the Porsche forums asking for help replacing theirs around this mileage. It got me to thinking though, why are these parts failing so early? After examining the lower control arms, I found that only the rear bushing had failed. After inspecting the rear bushing, it was pretty obvious why it had failed. Porsche decided to use a hollow rear bushing on the lower control arm, which is nowhere near as durable as a solid bushing. After seeing this designed to fail engineering in the Porsche control arms, I decided to take a chance on a set of aftermarket control arms from Mevotech. Mevotech offers a supreme line of control arms that they claim are overbuilt. This includes a larger ball joint, solid bushings, and increased thickness and depth in the control arm for enhanced strength. Mevotech hasn't paid me to do this video, and they didn't send me a set of free control arms to install on my car. With that being said, time will tell if these control arms are in fact overbuilt. At over half the cost of the OEM control arms, these supreme arms from Mevotech are worth a shot. If your car is equipped with air suspension, it must be put in workshop mode before lifting the vehicle. If you fail to do this, the ride height sensors could lose their calibration. If you don't know how to put your car in workshop mode, see my how-to video included in the playlist link. Inner tire wear is one of the common symptoms to lower control arm failure, and as you can see, I have plenty of that. In order to gain easier access to the suspension components, you'll need to remove the fender liner. Use a T25 Torx and a 10mm socket to remove it. Removing this fender liner was kind of a pain in the butt. Just be patient and you'll eventually get it. With the fender liner removed, now is also a good time to inspect your headlight wiring harness, water drains, and diverter valves for you turbo owners. Don't be alarmed if you hear a little air escaping while removing the air hose. I used a large breaker bar and 18mm socket to remove the upper control arm from the steering knuckle. Once you have the nut almost undone, use a sledgehammer or pickle fork to separate the ball joint from the steering knuckle. Oh, those sound lovely. This is why I think it's so important to replace both the upper and lower control arms at the same time. If one is bad, more than likely the other isn't too far behind. Next, use an 18mm socket and wrench to remove the stabilizer end link. Move the wires to the brake pad wear sensor out of the way, and disconnect the connector to the shock damper sensor. Use a 21mm socket and wrench to remove the lower shock mount nut and bolt. In order to gain access to the 3 upper strut mount bolts on each side of the car, we'll need to remove the engine beauty covers and wiper motor cowl. Instead of removing the cowl, some people have been able to access the bolts by lifting up on it. I chose to remove mine to better illustrate the location of the bolts. If you'd like to know how to remove your cowl, please see my how-to video on changing a Porsche Cayenne wiper motor. Next, move these plastic vacuum lines out of the way. Use a 10mm socket and ratchet to remove the brake booster vacuum pump from its mounting bracket and set it aside. There are three 16mm bolts on each side of the car that fasten the strut to the body of the car. 2 out of the 3 bolts are pretty easy to get to, while the last bolt under the windshield wiper cowl can be somewhat tricky without the cowl removed. If you'd like to replace your torn dust boot, make sure to see my how-to video. I'll leave a link in the description. Next, disconnect the ride height sensor arm from the control arm, and then use a 16mm socket and wrench to remove the upper control arm from its mount. Don't forget to remove the ride height sensor mount from the old control arm and install it on the new one. I positioned my control arms at a 90-degree angle to the strut. This is roughly the same angle the control arms are in when the suspension is set to low. We are now ready to reinstall the strut assembly. While I was holding the strut in place from below, my wife started installing the 3 bolts from above. Use a jack to raise the lower control arm. This will allow you to connect the ball joint from the upper control arm to the steering knuckle. We are now ready to replace the lower control arm. Before removing the lower control arm, make sure to mark the locations of the eccentric bolts and washers. When installing your new control arm, you will later use these markings in order to get the alignment settings close. Use an 18mm wrench to remove the lower control arm's ball joint from the steering knuckle. Next, I use a pickle fork to separate the ball joint from the steering knuckle. When loosening the 2 eccentric bolts and nuts, always loosen them from the nut side. Never try to loosen the eccentric bolt with your tool. Use a 21mm socket and wrench to loosen the nut. Now that both the eccentric bolts and nuts are removed, I can now remove the lower control arm from the car. I'm using a pry bar to separate the control arm from the subframe. Install the new lower control arm's ball joint onto the steering knuckle and tighten the 18mm bolt. Now install the other end of the control arm to the subframe. For now, just loosely install the nut on the eccentric bolt. There are a few other things we have to do before we can tighten the eccentric bolts and nuts to the control arm. Use a jack to raise the control arm high enough in order to install and tighten the lower shock mount bolt and nut. We are now ready to tighten the eccentric bolts and nuts to the control arm. The first step is raising the car by its control arm to simulate it resting on wheels and tires. You only want to tighten the eccentric bolts and nuts when the suspension is in a resting position. Resting position is best achieved by the vehicle either actually being on its wheels and tires or mimicking it by the way that I'm doing it. See how I lined up the markings we made earlier with the markings on the frame? By doing this, the alignment should be close enough so I can drive the car to a shop to get a full alignment without ruining my tires. I decided to replace my stabilizer end link with one from Mevotech, since the bushings on the old one were starting to crack. Use an 18mm socket and wrench to install the stabilizer end link. Congratulations if you made it this far, because you are almost done. All that's left to do is reinstall the brake booster vacuum pump, engine beauty covers, fender liner, and front wheels. Make sure to get an alignment done before driving the car any length of time. After getting an alignment done and refurbishing the suspension, my Cayenne feels like a new car. The car no longer makes weird noises when going over bumps, and the handling is phenomenal. My only regret is I should have done this sooner. If you'd like to see more Cayenne DIY videos, make sure to hit that like button. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section, and I'll do my best to answer them. So long.